Hi guys, welcome to the very first fireside chat at the Future Law Virtual Summit 2020 with our keynote speaker, Dr. Margaret Heffernan, one of the defining voices of our time. Not only is she a really respected business leader, having been a chief executive officer of 5 internet companies, but she's also written some of the most defining books of our time. One of her books, Willful Blindness, Financial Times named it the most critical, or one of the most critical books of the decade. And her latest book, Uncharted, How Do We Map the Future Together? So join me for this fireside chat, this really special conversation that I had with Margaret Heffernan, one of the most defining voices of our time. Dr. Margaret Heffernan, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us for this very first fireside chat in the Future Law Virtual Summit 2020. It's really a privilege of mine to have you here.
Well, it's exciting for me to get to know you and to get to know the Future Law Institute. I think I'm really excited by what you're up to.
Thank you. And as you know, I've been trying to get onto you for quite a number of years. And I was in preparation for this. I was just going through some emails recently and came across an email that I wrote to your team in 2014 inviting you to be the keynote speaker in the Caribbean Procurement Institute conference. And we weren't able to connect at that time. What's happening now is that you've just written Uncharted. And this book, Uncharted, correct me if I'm wrong, was published prior to the onset of COVID-19, wasn't it?
Yes. So I started writing it in 2016. I'm quite a slow writer, partly because I do a lot of other things, and partly because I do a lot of research, which takes a lot of time. So I started in 2016, and I finished it at October 2019, and it came out 3 weeks before lockdown in the UK.
But the most surreal thing about this book is that in that book, it actually predicts almost the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is the kind of uncertain future that we need to create preparedness plans for. And we're going to get to that book later in this interview, but I do want to talk a bit. You've done such incredible things. Not only have you been the CEO of several technology companies, you've also written 6 leadership and business books. Most of them have been recorded as some of the best books, business books. And for example, Willful Blindness, which was a book that really influenced me in my work in the Caribbean. I believe the Financial Times, said it was one of the defining books and most critical business books to be read in 2015. What you've been able to do is really, I would say, uncharted, right? And so
very much so.
Yeah. So before we jump into your work and what you've done, I really would love to get to know you better, and for the people who are attending this conference to get to know a little bit about you better, Margaret. How did you become Dr. Margaret Heffernan with these 6, acclaimed books and all of this business experience behind you?
Well, not with a plan, right?
Right.
And there's quite a lot, in Uncharted about how life itself is uncharted. And I think, we've really suffered, I think, quite a lot in the last 20 years or so from this notion that, we must all lead rigorously organized, highly efficient, maximized lives. We should measure everything in our lives and measure everything in our kids' lives, and then we can put together, this perfect life. And I think, honestly, I think it's bogus, which is to say I don't think it's even reasonably possible. And I also think it's kind of deadly. I feel sorry for the kid who grows up with the mother who's measuring, every test and every, idea and every development and every interest, and doesn't just allow a child to develop and discover and explore. And, so I've had this rather strange life, which is I was born in Texas. I moved to the Netherlands because my father worked in the oil industry. Then I moved to England. I went to university here. I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I left university, so I joined the BBC as a typist.
Wow.
You know, kind of a stupid idea, but not disastrous, obviously, because I stayed at the BBC for 13 years, not as a typist, obviously. And then I thought, well, actually what happened after that was I looked around and I thought, everybody at most meeting tables is at least 10 or 15 years older than I am. They're mostly male, and I'm going to have to wait for all of them to retire. And I'm not the world's greatest filmmaker, and I think there are other people around who are better at it than I am, so I'd like to go off and do something else. And so that's when I ran my first company in the UK. Then my husband does medical research, so we moved to the United States because he got a position at Harvard. We arrived in Boston, and the media market in Boston is pretty dull and conservative. So I started working with tech companies because it seemed to be where all the most interesting thinking was. And I did that for 8.5, nearly 9 years. I had a fantastic, fantastic time. Learned an incredible amount, hired some fantastic people. And then I got very burned out and reached a point where I thought, right, it's time for something new. My life seems to go in kind of 13-year cycles for some reason, where I just get a moment where I think, right, I've done as much of this as either I can do or I want to do. And I moved back to the UK thinking now I need a business with no employees because I'd hired and managed so many people. And of course that doesn't leave you a lot of options.
Right.
But a friend of mine who's a literary agent said, well, you should write. You write really well and you should write a book about the internet because you were there at the beginning. And I thought about that and thought, it's either too early or too late. I'm not sure which. But I did start thinking about what is it I really want to write about. And my first 2 books were really about women in business because I thought there were still huge issues that nobody was talking about. And nobody was talking about them at the time. In fact, of course, like many writers, I had a huge problem getting my first book published because I wanted to write about the obstacles women were encountering at work. Right. And nobody thought there were any. And I got the opportunity to write a magazine article on the topic. And I just got this unbelievable response, literally from thousands of women saying, thank you for finally calling it as it is. And that really propelled the book into publication. So I wrote those 2 books, and then I discovered that if you write about women, you find yourself in quite an uncomfortable, tiny little ghetto where nobody thinks you can talk to anybody but women, even though it's really men who need to hear what you're saying. So I thought, okay, I've got to get out of this. I need to write about something broader. And then, because I'd done a lot of radio drama when I was at the BBC, I wrote 2 plays about the collapse of Enron. Right. Partly, I think, because I was one of the few people who could both write a play and read a balance sheet. Right? And in doing the research for that, I read the transcript of the trial of the chairman and the chief exec. And that's where I came across this legal concept, which you, of course, will be familiar with, of willful blindness. Right. And this just sent a chill down my spine. There's so many things in life I have puzzled over and thought, how can that be? Right. And this idea seemed to explain it. So I just went off on a tear to see where was it and how did it work and how could you explain it? And if you could even explain it, might you be able to curtail it somewhat?
And that is the book that, came across my attention. It was the first time I, got connected to your work. And what I think is really incredible of what you've done there, it's not only just about amazing stories, because you're a great storyteller, but you've also packed it with all of this research and neuroscience as well. So you're looking at the studies about how we think. And one of the interesting things you said there is that actually emotion and like love and fear and our drive to comply and conform is what, is contributing to our willful blindness. So could you share a little more about that? Why is it that we would be in organizations or we'd be in situations where We know something is wrong. We know there's something that should not be happening. Right. And a lot of us bury our heads in the sand. Right. From your research, why is that happening? Yeah. Why do we do that?
Yeah. I mean, there are lots and lots of reasons. You know, one reason is that we tend to be very attracted to people like ourselves. So what that does is it narrows our focus, which means that all sorts of things that we probably could see and think about, we don't see. And in that context, I would cite the fact that so many middle-class white Americans, and to be fair, middle-class white British people, have been so taken aback by Black Lives Matter because their lives were fine. And most of them, most of my friends have few or no African, Caribbean, African American friends, or Asian, or, they will say they're not biased, but the truth is that they've always moved from a school that was all white to a university that was all white to a company that was all white, and that may not have been deliberate, but it's ended up that they were wildly out of touch with people whose lives experiences were very much different from their own.
Yeah, because they're creating their own bubbles, exactly. I guess.
Exactly.
And what are the implications right now when, in terms of the data and social media and how our data is being used to ensure that only the things that we like, we keep getting more of that and more of that.
And I think, this is a source of huge heartbreak in a way for me, because when we first started working in the internet, the idea was that lots of voices that had never been heard would get access and would be able to publish their own work without having to go through gatekeepers, and that this would be really liberating. And I think all of us involved in what I think of as the first wave of the internet, that was the hope, and that fringe voices would be heard, and fringe musicians would get a hearing, and fringe writers and artists and designers, would have access to an audience without having to go through these institutional barriers. And it was wildly idealistic and maybe romantic, but I think it was genuinely well-intentioned. And of course, what we found is what economists call perverse outcomes, which is that in order to organize all those voices, tools were invented so that you could limit the voices that you listen to. And so people had the tools now to create an even tougher bubble than they were already in.
Sure.
And then as they did that, what happened is that surrounded by people who shared their beliefs, those beliefs became more extreme. And, the other night I was lying awake at night thinking, do you think it would have been better if the internet had not happened?
Really?
And, I change my mind on this all the time. There's a very big part of me that thinks it would have been better.
Wow.
But we are where we are, right? So that's an interesting intellectual game, perhaps, for me to play with myself.
But don't you think the connections that we're able to make...
But that's the point. Borders. See, that's what we wanted. We thought it would all be that. We didn't, exactly. Yeah. Even though we live, within 10 miles of each other now, that's how we found each other. And that's what we all hoped for. And now we have to deal with the equal and opposite reaction, right, which is this intensification of extremely narrow views. And I think we have to be quite fierce in recognizing we can't just brush it off as, just a kind of accident. I think we have to be prepared to deal with it, both in the way that we deal with it personally and the way that we start shaping laws and institutions to deal with it. Because I think, in retrospect, this notion that let 1,000 flowers bloom, of course it was naive. And and in the same way that, when cars were first invented, nobody had traffic signals or seat belts or any of that kind of thing. It's only as these things develop that you see where the harm lies.
Yeah, and this is so, this is why I think your book, Willful Blindness, is still so critical and relevant in these times, because it points us, I think, and maybe you can share a little bit about how do you think we can change? How do you think we can, because what we've done with the internet is what our brain does naturally. You know, we create these filters. And with the internet, as you were just mentioning, we sort of put things in place to even harden and intensify that narrowing. So how do we, is it possible to roll that back? How do we change?
I mean, I don't know. I think, there's certainly people arguing that, social media such as Facebook and Twitter and so on should be taken down. Would the world be worse off without them? I rather doubt it, to be honest. Is it possible to run them in ways that makes them safer? Probably, maybe not. I mean, it is a ferociously difficult task. But I think there are two issues really. One is, what can we do as individuals, and what can we do, what can institutions do?
Yeah.
Institutions, I think, have to fight for and abide by laws that make the internet safer. And I think we have to get over this kind of free market libertarianism that says, oh no, just, let it go, it'll find its own equilibrium. It has found its own equilibrium significantly in the gutter, right? But I also think there's a personal responsibility. And, this may sound a little hokey, but I do kind of make a point of trying to get to know people not like me. One reason I moved to the countryside was because the sorts of people I work with and write about, by and large, aren't there. My neighbors haven't the faintest idea what I do, and they don't really care. And so I have to think about their lives and what does life look like for them, which is very different from my experience of it. And, the same in a lot of the work I do with a broad range of institutions. On one level, I'm not a lawyer. What am I doing working with the Future Law Institute? Right. Because this is a host of people who know lots of things I don't, with a background that is not mine, from which I hope to learn as much as I teach. And so I'm very drawn to organizations and people that are not like me. And it is quite a conscious and deliberate effort.
And we're doing the same thing, my partner and I, Anya, in Future Law Institute, trying to create these interdisciplinary spaces. Exactly. Because we as lawyers have been in such silos for so long. We focus on our niche area of the law, we focus within our jurisdiction, and it's part of what has gotten us to where we are today, because we share one planet. Right. And if we share one planet, how can we come together and try to solve some of our collective problems? You know what is interesting, I find, Dr. Heffernan, about your work and tracing the books that you've written, it seems as if one builds on the other and one points to a bigger idea and a bigger idea. And so I clocked in with you, as you know, from Willful Blindness. And from there, you went to a bigger prize. Right. Why a win-win is not always the best win. And that really takes on capitalism in an interesting way. I mean, it's not the usual pound it into the ground. Right. There is an understanding that, there is a place of sorts for competition. But I mean, you really go right to the jugular of it. And to me, that's you taking a step up now in terms of ideas there. So what are the alternatives, you would say?
Well, I'm so glad you picked that out for two reasons. One is it's a book that's been largely ignored, and I feel it's rather like the sort of middle child, that doesn't get a lot of attention.
And have it in the middle here too.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that's kind of funny is I remember my husband was sitting in at a event I did actually at the University of Bath. And afterwards he said, I think you're writing a trilogy. I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, well, what's the next one? He said, I don't know, but you'll find out. And it's a really astute insight.
Really?
Because it definitely wasn't planned, but you're exactly right, they all connect. So a bigger prize really came out of my recognition writing Willful Blindness. The competition always made willful blindness worse.
That's right.
Always, always, always. And then in very competitive environments, people are so focused on the goal and they're so focused on winning that they can't see anything else. They have no peripheral vision. And it's interesting because, you know, I've had the good luck or bad luck, depending on how you see it, to sit back and see that thesis being proved over and over and over again. You know, the disaster that is Facebook has grown partly because of this complete obsession with growth, right? Yeah. The planet is being trashed because of our obsession with growth, because China wants a bigger economy than America, and India wants to be bigger than China, and everybody wants to be bigger than somebody. And this is a disaster. You know, it's a disaster for human beings. It's a disaster in families. It's a disaster in other disciplines like science. I would even suggest, though you must know much more about this than I do, that a lot of competition between lawyers is often not exactly how the best judgments are reached.
Absolutely.
You know, and I just felt, you know, we've somehow mindlessly swallowed this argument that competition means, you know, the best rises to the top. Boris Johnson said this thing about, you know, how the best cornflakes are always at the top of the packet. I mean, what an analogy. And I just thought it's wrong. And every place I looked, families, schools, science, health, business, everywhere I looked, it had these devastating consequences.
And I do want to ask you something about that, because you're saying that it does contribute to growth. Mm. It does have people all focused on a goal. Right. We have the UN and the reports that came out in the last couple of years showing that we're not going to meet our targets, you know, for climate crisis and all of that. And there is a lot of movement and mobilization right now. One, to apply capital to achieving Agenda 2030 and around the whole concept of social entrepreneurship. Right. Do you think that we can apply the power, the mechanism that is the market towards solving some of the greatest challenges facing us today? Is it an either or, that it's either we try to solve the problems or we compete?
I don't think the market alone will do it, not because it isn't a fearsome beast, because obviously it is. It's too slow. Mm. You know, climate change is working faster than the market is. The market is always a register of what, you know, it's a kind of historical record almost, or historical response to what's happening. But, you know, in order to address the climate crisis, we could have and we should have started 30 years ago. You know, I can remember talking to my husband about climate change in the 80s and just saying, you know, the length of a political term militates against any long-term strategy on this. So everybody kicks the can into the future, which is actually, of course, what's happened. But so I think a couple of things. I think, you know, and we are definitely seeing this now, which is great, which is a recognition that no country alone can solve this problem. You know, we have got to collaborate. Our lives literally depend on it. I guess, you know, because people are competitive and you're never totally going to get rid of that. I wish people would compete on going green, right? Rather than just, you know, market capitalization. Yeah. And I think you're starting to see that. But it's interesting because I did a long interview a few months ago with Paul Pullman, chief exec of Unilever, who did this amazing thing, which is he said, we are going to run this company in a way that decouples growth from environmental degradation. Yeah. So we're not going to let ourselves grow with anything that does environmental harm. Right. And he broke lots of rules to do that. And everybody admired him. And almost nobody followed in his footsteps. It's like, well, great, Paul Pullman becomes the poster child for good capitalism, but not me. You know, I still want my share price to go up. Yeah. I think, and this, you know, this may be insane on my part, but I think, you know, what we are learning the hard way, and we seem somehow destined only to learn the hard way, is that just as with the pandemic, you know, if we do not work together, we're all going to fail together.
And that brings me to this point because, you know, a lot of us have been educated with this neoliberal mindset. Like within the last 30, 40 years, we've been educated in this way. And I remember when I was younger, I was very much into that mindset. I hadn't started unpacking what it really meant in society. And I had to really do the work to start unlearning some of the things that I held to be true. And so the question I have for you is, what are the new skills that we need to learn to really be able to collaborate with each other, to embrace this collaboration mindset that you speak of in a bigger prize?
I think the first thing we have to recognize is that our competitive instincts should always trigger a warning, right? Which is, you know, is this because you want to do something excellent, or is it because you want someone else to fail? Right? And just because there are certainly moments, you know, I'm no saint. There are moments in my life where, you know, somebody does something or says something and I kind of bridle, you know, and I think, actually, just calm down, Margaret, you know. So let me give you a really, really banal, simple example. When my kids were in school, and you'd have these weird conversations with very competitive parents, right? Nothing brings out competitiveness worse than parents and their kids. So you'd have these conversations in the playground, you know, where a mum would say, oh, I'm so worried about Richard, you know, he only got 9 A stars in his GCSEs, you know, and he really wants to get into Oxford, and he's just not working hard enough. And of course, that's partly saying, look at my brilliant son, therefore I'm a brilliant mother. Aren't I wonderful? You know, which of course was designed to make me feel bad. And then I would say something, you know, that would kind of raise the stakes, you know, which is, I don't know what I might say, but something about, well, you know, you have to be really careful with all this pressure because, you know, it might do terrible things to their mental health. You know, well, now we're just in a fight to the death, right? And what I learned to do was think, she's saying that because she's really anxious. So think about what can you do to reduce the anxiety. So I would say, but I think 9 A stars is really brilliant. And the thing that's incredible is he has those 9 A stars and he's a really lovely boy. And you could just see the shoulders drop. And now you could be friends. Whereas before we were on a path to never speaking. And so I think one of the things we have to learn is that a lot of people's competitive instincts are to do with feeling threatened. Right. And that the only appropriate antidote is generosity. And, you know, that sounds maybe a little idealistic. It's astounding how well it works. I'd just say that for a start. You know, so you can get back to having a real conversation. But I think the other thing I found, you know, the heart and soul of collaboration is people getting to know each other and getting to know each other properly. And, you know, it's been very fashionable in large organizations really to think of people as just their function or their experience or what grade they're in or, you know, what level they're at, and to kind of move them around like pieces on a chessboard. And actually, when you look at high functioning, very creative, sustainably creative organizations, they're full of people who know each other very well, will always help each other, and have a sense of solidarity about what the organization's trying to do. So they are not competing with each other. They understand that working together, they build a better organization, and the better organization can do better work in the world. So they're able to connect to something that's bigger and more powerful and effective than they could ever be alone. And I think I'm seeing more and more organizations understand that. I think they don't always understand that they have to throw out some of the competition-inducing behaviors. But I think people are especially since the pandemic, they're starting to realize, incredibly, actually, if they don't look after each other, nothing's going to get done.
Right. And so it's really about, just listening to you, it's about us becoming more mindful of our own reactions to what other people are saying. So it is about us developing this sense of presence and a little distance from our own emotional gut
Yeah.
reactions to what other people are achieving, doing, seeing in our present, and then becoming really curious about the other.
And that's it. I think it's about being curious about people and thinking, well, I don't know everything. I have a lot I could learn from you. I have a lot I can learn from everybody. And that's actually a much richer mindset to be in than to see everybody as a threat. And how do I take that threat out?
And this brings us to this book, and I think I really have to come to this. This book that I think is
Eerie.
I don't know how you did this, Margaret. I really don't know how you did this. Uncharted: How to Map the Future Together. And if persons would go straight to the last chapter, if they would just go to the last chapter, it is writing about being prepared for an epidemic, for a pandemic that will travel around the world at rapid speed. It's surreal when you read this, and you really see some powerful pieces in here that I do want to reference a bit as we go into this book, because I feel that what you've done here is showcase how we've gotten to where we are today by our addiction to prediction. Right. Prediction, addiction, right? And that's chapter one. But we want to know, and we measurement, and we want, this is what is going to happen, and we can forecast. And really and truly, you said something quite, you said history does not repeat itself. Isn't that really quite provocative? Because
it's so interesting, because I mean, everybody thinks history repeats itself until they think about it. Yeah. And in a way, history can't repeat itself, because people making history today know the history of the past, which the people in the past did not know. And, the German philosopher Karl Popper argued that the future is made by new knowledge. And by definition, people in the past can't have known what that new knowledge was going to be. So we're always acting on the knowledge of history. It should inform what we think is possible. But we have all sorts of knowledge that's been added to it ever since. And it's one reason why, for example, in the pandemic, we're looking a lot at what has helped in pandemics in the past. Right. I think it may be one reason why countries that have done better, like South Korea, are countries that have already had to deal with epidemics like MERS and SARS. So I think there's a lot to learn from history. But the idea that it repeats itself is incredibly dangerous, because what you find happens is that people overweight the similarities and they underweight the differences. So, famous example is Eisenhower and Kennedy and LBJ seeing in Vietnam the same kind of power issue confronting a ruthless dictator as occurred in Munich. Now, almost everything about what was happening in the South in the Vietnamese War had nothing to do with that. So by thinking we're fighting the Second World War, what happened is the American government didn't learn about Vietnamese culture, didn't learn about Vietnamese history, didn't learn about what the Vietnamese people actually wanted, and as a consequence made year after year after year of catastrophic, ignorant, uninformed decisions. That's the power of an analogy. And I think and you hear this all the time, you hear it ridiculously. For example, you hear Boris Johnson these days comparing the pandemic to the Second World War. It's absurd. It's so unhelpful. And, it suggests that we have this kind of grasp of the future that we don't have. He would be much better off to say, we are in new territory and we are finding our way. And there is no guarantee that just because we're British, we're going to do so brilliantly.
And So how would you map, how do we come together to map the future in such an uncertain time? This is the defining question of your book.
Well, so I think the first thing we have to do is we have to accept that uncertainty is here, it's real, and understand why. So, and I wrote about this at the beginning of the book, earlier it used to be that a lot in life was complicated. The systems we ran were complicated. Right. That meant they were linear, they were subject to cause and effect, they were very well optimized by efficiency and by technology, and they allowed us to plan. Think of an assembly line, right? In the last 30 years, because of globalization and pervasive technology, and especially communications technology, we've gone from a complicated model of the world to a complex one. So it's not linear. There may be more factors at work than we can even identify. Cause may not have an obvious effect, and a cause may also be an effect. That means that very small things, like a virus, can have a disproportionate effect. A tiny, invisible virus can bring the whole world's economy to a standstill. And that means that expertise in and of itself won't always help us, because things are changing so fast. Nobody has been where we are today before. Nobody has expertise in the future because nobody's been there. And therefore, we can't make accurate predictions. So we have to give up our habit of forecast, plan, execute, and start thinking about what are the things that could happen that might have a big impact, for which we should prepare. And what's quite interesting in this space is that actually the British government and the American governments between 2015 and 2019 did start to prepare for an epidemic. Right. And then we got a little, so they had epidemic plans, there was an epidemic playbook in the White House. In the United States, they even war-gamed a pandemic in 2019, and they saw all the things that were going to go wrong. Wow. Right? But then they thought, well, it'll never happen. So they just threw the learning away. They saw all the kind of, the contest between states and federal governments. They saw that. They saw that agency communications were bad. They saw that everybody was siloed. They saw that there were very poor connectivity between the important different agencies. But they didn't do anything with the knowledge. That's willful blindness, right?
I was going to say willful blindness.
Right. In the UK, we became, especially with austerity, we became so obsessed with this idea of efficiency. We kept thinking everything in the world is like that. That, we had something like 99% occupancy of critical care beds. Right. That looks super efficient, right? No waste. Actually, it's a big alarm bell. If you even have a big motorway crash, you're in trouble. But we kind of thought, well, these epidemics, they happen in Asia. They don't happen to us. And so we stopped preparing. And we could have prepared, and we should have prepared. And this is one reason why the organization that I write about in my book, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, came into being, because a number of people, especially the Wellcome Institute and the Gates Foundation, realized that global governments were taking their eye off the ball. And they said, actually, we've got to do something, because if this ever happens, we're in big trouble. And they came up with this, I think, very brilliant formulation of a great question. And I'm a sort of collector of great questions, which is, when an epidemic breaks out, what will we wish we had been doing now? And they started doing that in 2017.
Right. And in your book, you say this: to define a future no one can see yet requires radical imagination. What would you say radical imagination is?
I think radical imagination is sort of daring to think the unthinkable. So instead of saying, well, here are all the reasons why there isn't going to be a pandemic, challenge yourself to say, okay, fine, you may be right. We don't know, and we know we don't know. So let's do the thought experiment. If there's a pandemic, what will we wish we had been doing today? Just park the argument of whether it's going to happen or not. Because the truth of the matter is that if it does happen, we're way behind. And because there may be a low likelihood, but a sky-high impact, we cannot afford not to do this. It may not look efficient. We're going to start developing vaccines we may never use. We may start developing vaccines that don't work. We may start developing networks of communication between health systems that we never need to call upon. But the truth is, if we're efficient and an epidemic strikes, we're completely lost.
And this coalition that was set up here, what has happened with that? How did that help us to respond with COVID-19?
So it's meant that we were further ahead in vaccination development than we thought. We were further ahead in building contractual relationships with the producers, manufacturers, and distributors of vaccines than we ever thought. We had much more trusted and entrenched relationships around the world with different medical personnel. And it's meant that there's a sort of center of really core expertise that can now advise us going forward. Now, obviously, the coalition would much prefer that they'd started 10 years earlier, right? Yeah. But we did not go into this epidemic with nothing. But we could have, and we should have gone into it with more.
And Margaret, we are coming down to we're winding down this conversation. For those who are looking on, and we have close to 2,000 people already tuning in, and afterwards this conversation is freely available. It's freely available in this summit right now and will be available after. What would you say, final words you would say to people looking on who are feeling a little anxiety because of how uncertain our future is? They're looking around, and this is an uncertain time. How should professionals show up in this time? What should we be doing and thinking about doing, and what kinds of mindset should we be developing? I know it's a big question.
No, but I think it's a great question. I think the key thing, and this is a big theme in this book, is to recognize that nobody out there has the answer. Right? We have not been here before. Everybody has different life experiences, and you have to listen to them and take them seriously. You cannot imagine that your experience of the pandemic is the same as mine, or is the same as your neighbors, or the same as someone in a different country. So you have to do a lot of very broad perspective taking and come to understand that at a time of uncertainty, any kind of uncertainty, if you don't do that perspective taking, you will be blind, right? Which comes back to where we started. Yeah. And you have to start crafting what you do with all of those perspectives. Not only because you're more likely to find a better answer, which you are, but because a strategy that's been developed with all those different perspectives is going to be much easier to persuade people of because they helped create it. Right. And I think that our major institutions around the world now, I mean, clearly they have many, many, many problems. I think the problem they're still blind to is that in many people's minds there is a very big question about their legitimacy. In whose name do you do what you do? Right. And the only way to address legitimacy is to reach out and work with the groups whom you purport to serve. You can no longer do this effectively in a complex world by sitting at the top of the pyramid and issuing decrees. And I think, on a really positive note, I think this is what the was proved when the Irish government so fastidiously conducted a citizens' assembly. So everybody knows that, when the abortion vote came up in Ireland, it was the decision to amend the law on abortion in Ireland to liberalize it was passed by roughly a 65% majority. And everybody was amazed and then thought, well, this is great, aren't the Irish wonderful? What they were not paying attention to is how did they get there? They got there by listening to everybody, by sharing information pervasively. They got there with absolutely radical transparency, radical discussion and openness, and a real capacity to listen. And it's sort of amazing to me that those of us who still believe in democracy thought that democracy was good enough that it would never have to adapt and never have to change. And we've woken up late to the idea that actually any institution that wants to maintain its legitimacy has to keep adapting and evolving. And that's how you don't let uncertainty catch you by surprise, because you make the future instead of waiting for it to just fall down on you.
Yeah, and that, I know we wanted to end, but that just reminded me of another important point that, you bring out in the book, and it's the importance of action and not holding on to, fearfully holding on to the status quo, but facing uncertainty and having the courage to take action. The story of John and Mary, John the priest, and I think you said it here, the way John had put it, he left the church, for this love that he had, and he said action. And when he was talking about, well, how do you search? How do you find this meaning? How do you know what's the next right thing to do in the world? And he said, action is how you search. Giving up the need for certainty gave him the freedom to discover. And I mean, the way you put some of these thoughts and ideas together, not only is this rich with guidance for us, but it's also very enriching to read. From a poetic standpoint, I find some of the way you put words together. And so I think for Future Law Institute, a lot of what you say really helps us as we chart this uncharted course of bringing lawyers together multilaterally all over the world and saying, listen, at our level, we are not politicians, we are not the UN, but at our level as professionals, we know our legal systems. Let's work out how we can get certain policies passed at the local level, work together at a multilateral level and make stuff happen. And so we don't know how this is going to go. We are experimenting, just as you talk a lot about here in this book. And I would like to close with a paragraph from your book. Sure. Because I would love to encourage people to go out and get this book, because we're in a defining moment of our times. Uncharted, How to Map the Future Together by Dr. Margaret Heffernan. And this book really can help us to think together and act together in a way that we are not accustomed to. We're not trained to do this. So we need to learn as much as we can. So I just want to read this paragraph. Making the future is a collective activity because no one person can see enough. No one can have an adequate argument alone or in an echo chamber. So the capacity to see multiple futures depends critically on the widest possible range of contributors and collaborators. Leave perspectives out and the future is incomplete or invisible. This isn't only a democratic imperative, but a frank acknowledgement that those not involved in making the future will have knowledge and motive to upend it. The emergence of open strategy in which individuals at all levels can contribute to mapping their organization's future, and I would say our nation's future, your community's future, the global future, is much more than a tacit acknowledgement that insight and intelligence exists everywhere. And then I want to thank you, Dr. Heffernan, for writing this book and for being here with us to guide us in this time. Do you have any last words you'd like to say?
Well, that's very kind of you. I mean, I'm quite touched by what you pulled out, because, there's certain things when you write a book that just live with you forever. And I think John's comment, action is how you search, is it for me. You don't know when you do something what will happen.
That's right.
But if you do nothing, exactly what will happen, which is nothing. And you can't look for guarantees. But you know that if you take action, you will learn something, which will lead you to the next step, and the next step, and the next step. And that's how you change the world.
Thank you, Dr. Heffernan. Will we take the next step together?
Definitely.
Thank you.